Good afternoon. Welcome to the second class in the introductory course on the theory and practice of regulation. It's a pleasure to be back and to have you all with us today. Today we are very gratified and fortunate to have Professor William Boyd from the UCLA Law School joining us to discuss just price and the public utility, a short history. I first became aware of Professor Boyd in trying to learn more about why it is in regulation we have adopted the notion of a just price and how that concept has evolved. And I found a wonderful article that he wrote in the Yale Journal of Regulation, which we've shared the link for you all to enjoy as well. As we were developing this course, he was a natural linchpin in describing some of the basics of regulation, and he happily agreed to join us today to give his talk. Give us a lecture. Professor Boyd is in a way unique in terms of the industry. As an academic, he has experience with congressional committees. He has both a PhD in energy and resources from the University of Berkeley, as well as a law degree from Stanford. He brings an awful lot of perspective to this subject, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Boyd. But before I do, I want to just go over some housekeeping. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A option in Zoom. You will see that at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send the questions during the course of the lecture. We will return to the questions at the end of the lecture. And also, this whole regulatory training initiative is a new process, and we look forward to hearing your feedback, comments, and suggestions. At the end of this course, we will send out a review questionnaire, and hopefully you'll return that to us. With that, please welcome Professor Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl, and thanks for the kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. I just want to say how delighted I am to be part of this NRRI series on regulation and part of the regulatory training initiative that Carl has really put together and spearheaded. I want to thank Carl, Sherry, Jeff, Victor, and the whole NRRI team for their work in organizing this. I want to thank my fellow presenters. It's a real all-star cast, and I really feel honored to be part of this. And finally, I want to thank all of you. It's a real privilege for me to be able to speak to actual utility regulators, even if a bit intimidating. So we've got a lot to cover today, but before I jump in, I want to set the stage a bit by highlighting or maybe reminding us of some of the ways that the pandemic has showed us once again why we care about fair pricing in the provision of necessities, which has long been the core mission of public utility law. During the early days of the pandemic, as I'm sure you all remember, there were widespread concerns with price gouging for personal protective equipment, hand sanitizer, medicines, and the like, all of which drew upon and invoked deep commitments to fair pricing, which I want to sort of talk about today. More recently, we've seen ongoing debates about moratoria on utility shutoffs because of inability to pay. And I think we've all been reminded of the vital importance of access to these services, water, electricity, gas, internet, in the face of COVID, fire canes, hurricanes, and all the rest. My task for today is to give you some historical context for how these core commitments to fair pricing and the provision of necessities become embedded in the theory and practice of public utility regulation. And specifically, I want to give you a brief history of the concept of just price, the basic idea behind just and reasonable rates, as well as some history of the broader concept of public utility. It is a long history. It goes back a couple of thousand years. We're going to focus mainly on the 20th century, and I'll bring the story up to the present. And I think it connects with and complements several aspects of the first class in the series that Carl did. And maybe we'll sort of, I think, preview some of the issues that will come up in some of the later classes. I also want to emphasize right at the start that I view public utility not as a thing or as a type of business, but really as a broader normative undertaking, as a collective project aimed at harnessing the power of private enterprise and directing it toward public ends. And in my view, public utility is one of the most important legal innovations in all of American jurisprudence. It is one that exemplifies the creative force of law. As Felix Frankfurter wrote in 1930, no task more profoundly tests the capacity of our government, both in nation and state, than its share in securing for society those essential services which are furnished by public utilities. Efforts to develop the concept of public utility and to put it into practice have been very influential on other areas of law, from rethinking basic ideas of property to early and influential work on administrative law and regulation to the Brandeisian notion of the states as laboratories of democracy. And as I bring the story forward, I want to emphasize not only the longstanding commitments to fair pricing and the provision of necessities, but also the experimentalist potential of public utility. I think there's far more policy innovation happening in PUCs around the country than people realize. And I think there's actually far more capacity for innovation than state legislators, executives, PUC commissioners, and staff likely recognize. I also think this capacity for innovation and experimentation is extremely important today in an age of dynamic technological change, economic and environmental disruption, and great uncertainty. So one of my goals today is to give you a sense of the long tradition of public utility and the commitment to fair pricing for key systems of provisioning as part of a broader, and I would argue still unfinished story about the importance of government regulation in finding new ways to harness the power of private enterprise and direct it toward public ends. And to remind you that you are the inheritors of that long tradition, in the hope that there may be some resources in that history that might inform your current work. So this is the roadmap of what I want to cover today. There are four main parts to the history, as you can see from the slide, and then some discussion at the end on public utility in our current age of disruption. We begin with the idea of just price, which is a term that may sound odd or out of place to the modern ear. We don't usually think of prices as having moral or ethical content, but a moment's reflection should make clear that most of us harbor deep commitments to fair pricing, commitments that have been confirmed in experimental behavioral studies and across cultures, and that go way back. For the West, the idea of just price traces its origins to Aristotle's concept of corrective justice, which was refashioned as commutative justice by Thomas Aquinas and other medieval scholars during the 12th and 13th centuries. And in the context of economic transactions, these scholars argued that commutative justice required that there be a rough equality in the exchange between buyer and seller. Instances of compulsion or coercion where one party was able to extract more than his or her fair share from the exchange violated commutative justice. The just price, the justum pretium in Latin, was the price, typically a range, that ensured equality between buyer and seller in any particular transaction. So far, so good. But it's not so easy to understand what was meant by this for everyday transactions in medieval markets. And there were significant debates in the economic history literature during the first half of the 20th century over the exact meaning of just price, with heavyweights like Max Weber and Joseph Schumpeter weighing in with different interpretations. For Schumpeter and others, and this is important for our story near the end of the talk, the just price was typically the price that resulted from the functioning of what he called normal competitive markets. In effect, competition on both sides of the bargain between buyers and between sellers protected everyone from the possibility of coercion and produced a just price. The problem, of course, was that many, if not most, medieval markets were not normal competitive markets, and a number of scholars over the second half of the 20th century suggested that the medieval understanding of just price was not simply the price prevailing in normal competitive markets. Rather, in cases of relatively thin markets, and especially in cases of scarcity for economic necessities like grain, the market price could not be counted on to reflect the just price. In these cases, community norms and customs were called upon to enforce a just or fair price. Sometimes the authorities also stepped in to impose price regulation on various necessities such as bread and beer. And as a way of regulating prices, just price was always grounded in a broader set of customs and norms within the community, what was sometimes called the common estimation of the community. The idea that the economy constituted a sphere of activity separate from social, political, and ethical relations made little sense. Prices were not simply or exclusively economic phenomena, but were embedded within a more general moral economy. Now, this idea of moral economy was developed by the British historian Edward Thompson in his work on food riots in England during the 18th century. And Thompson showed that these food riots played a key role in enforcing a just price during times of dearth or scarcity. He called this the moral economy of the crowd. And unlike the trade in other goods and services, the grain trade was widely viewed both in England and on the continent as too important to be left solely to the market. Price regulation, whether enforced by the crowd or by public authorities, was widely viewed as a necessary means for protecting consumers and maintaining social stability. And it's important to note here that these commitments to just price and moral economy were not limited to food riots. Indeed, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries and even before, in both Europe and America, in both civil and common law traditions, we see basic commitments to just price in a variety of areas, from the equitable conception of contract and the doctrine of unconscionability to the extensive price controls imposed by state and local governments in colonial America and the early United States. All of these drew on a longer history of governmental price controls and just price in England and continental Europe. Now, one does not have to travel far from these conceptions of just price and moral economy to get to the late 19th and early 20th century conceptions of public utility in the United States. And that's part of the story I try to tell in the article that Carl mentioned. With Monroe v. Illinois, the Supreme Court held that states could use their police powers to regulate prices charged by businesses affected with a public interest, setting in motion a train of doctrinal and conceptual developments that culminated in the modern idea of public utility. And throughout the course of this development, price regulation in the public interest drew upon these longstanding commitments to just price and fair exchange that I was just talking about. As these commitments are absorbed then into public utility regulation, they are gradually formalized and subjected to the dictates of administration and technical expertise, a process that sometimes resulted in great confusion, in part, as I will note in a minute, because of some bad decisions by the US Supreme Court. Monroe v. Illinois, which Carl talked about in his first lecture, was an 1877 case involving an Illinois statute setting maximum prices for grain elevators. And the law at issue in Monroe was virtually identical to a number of populist pro-farmer Granger-era statutes enacted throughout the Midwest during this time, seeking to curb the power of railroads and middlemen in the grain trade. In Monroe, the grain elevator owners are challenging the Illinois law, arguing that it deprives them of their property without due process. The court, of course, disagreed, lifting a phrase from Lord Hale's 17th century treatise on seaports and public wharves that Carl mentioned again in his lecture. The court held famously that because certain kinds of property, because certain kinds of businesses are affected with a public interest, they cease to be private property only and are subject to price regulation to protect the public interest. And in this case, on the facts of Monroe, right, because these grain elevators stood at the very center of the Midwestern grain trade, they were clearly affected with a public interest and could be regulated by the state under its police powers. It did not matter that the grain elevators were private businesses with no monopoly franchise from the government. It did not matter that they were not what we call later natural monopolies. It was the economic circumstances of the grain trade that had created what the court called a virtual monopoly, and with it the possibility of economic coercion. Now, Munn is sometimes seen as a conservative case because it required, according to some, an elaborate taxonomic exercise on the part of the court to determine which businesses fit into this category of businesses that were affected with a public interest. And there's a long line of cases trying to figure out whether things like movie tickets or milk sales or any variety of services and goods are businesses that are affected with a public interest. And after some stinging dissents from Justice Holmes and others, that effort came to an end in the 1934 case of Nebbia versus New York, when the Supreme Court held that states can regulate any business as long as they had a rational basis for doing so. But as the historian William Novak demonstrates, Munn also marked the beginning of the modern public utility era. And one can draw a direct line from the state public utility statutes of the early 20th century back to Munn. All of those statutes were explicitly grounded in the public interest. All of them also included this core commitment to just and reasonable rates. And the core commitment in Munn is a commitment to the idea of just price and to the protection of farmers and consumers from economic coercion. Now, building on the legacy of Munn, state public utility regulation gets going in the early 20th century, and states are using their police powers to regulate prices or rates charged by these businesses affected with a public interest. The key targets for regulation are the critical network industries that are taking shape during this time: natural gas, telephone, and electricity. Like the railroads, these classic public utilities were marked by high fixed capital requirements, substantial economies of scale, and extensive reliance on a network infrastructure that was very expensive to build and maintain. Together, these characteristics led to declining average costs across the relevant demand curve, creating a situation that economists since the late 19th century had referred to as natural monopoly. Drawing on earlier experiences with railroad regulation, New York and Wisconsin enact the first public utility statutes in 1907, the first modern public utility statutes in 1907. This is Governor Hughes on the left and Governor La Follette from Wisconsin. La Follette is the one with the great hair. These two leaders are big proponents of utility regulation in their respective states and beyond. And this then sets off what one historian called a veritable epidemic of laws across the country. By 1930, less than 25 years later, every single state but Delaware has enacted a public utility statute charging some type of entity, a PUC, a PSC, a corporation commission, a railroad commission, with responsibility for regulating public utilities. All of these statutes are grounded in the public interest. All of them include a commitment to just and reasonable rates. In some states, such as California, PUCs had a constitutional basis in addition to statutory powers. And the basic model was regulation by independent commission. These were in many ways quintessential examples of the progressive era faith in expert regulation. PUCs were novel, even unique. They combined legislative, executive, and judicial functions. Like all experience in government, of course, they also did not always live up to the ambitions of their designers. This is John Commons from the University of Wisconsin, a famous institutional economist in the kind of first third of the 20th century. Commons drafted Wisconsin's public utility law, which was widely considered to be the strongest of the early public utility statutes and was a model for other states. Key features of that law included mandatory universal service, protected local franchises, delegated powers of eminent domain, a cost base used in useful standard for valuing rate base, a uniform system of accounts, commission powers of investigation and adjudication, and most importantly, a requirement that utility rates be just and reasonable. The overall goal was to fix rates at a level that would prevent economic coercion and balance the needs of investors and ratepayers. Commons's core concern was to create a new legal regime that would prevent the possibility of economic coercion in the provision of economic necessities. And he built his economics around this problem of economic coercion, and he explicitly linked his efforts back to the medieval scholastic notions or conceptions of just price. One of his students, perhaps his most famous student, Martin Glaser, who also taught at Wisconsin for a while and was the author of a very influential treatise on public utility regulation in the 1920s, he identified the medieval conception of just price as, quote, the main stem upon which all other institutional developments in public utility regulation were grafted. And so for Commons and for the other early proponents of public utility regulation, rate regulation is a tool for regulating private property and pressing it into public service, for ensuring that the prices that are charged will be just prices, all of which is part of a broader experiment in the social control of business. And this experimentalist conception of public utility, which I mentioned at the very beginning, was widely embraced by leading scholars, jurists, and practitioners focused on public utility and the emerging practice of public utility regulation during the first half of the 20th century. Public utility commissions were the original laboratories of democracy, still are in my view, right? This is Justice Brandeis, and Justice Brandeis first uses that term, laboratories of democracy, in his dissent in a 1930 case, New State Ice versus Liebman, which addressed the question of whether Oklahoma could impose public utility regulation on the sale of ice. Brandeis, of course, thought they should be able to experiment and do that, right? The majority didn't agree. I should emphasize here, though, that for much of the 20th century, the experimentalist potential of PUCs was never fully realized. And I think it's still very much a work in progress. The capacity for policy innovation was crowded out by a range of factors: judicialization, understaffing, and a lack of resources, among other things, as well as 50 years of confusion over how to value utility property and to set rates. And the Supreme Court, as I mentioned earlier, bears much of the blame for that confusion. In an 1898 case, Smythe v. Ames, the court created its infamous fair value rule, which held that the rates that a railroad or utility could charge had to be based on the fair value of the utility's property, that is, the investments that the railroad or the utility had made in what we know as rate base. This brought the courts deep into the business of policing the methodology of rate making, and created a very confusing situation for commissions and their staff seeking to make sense of the fair value rule. And it took until 1944 in the Hope natural gas case for the Supreme Court to correct its error and to recognize, as scholars and others, including Brandeis in several dissenting and concurring opinions, had been saying for decades, right? That is, that the fair value rule was a tautology. How can rates be made to depend on the fair value of a utility's property if the value of the utility's property ultimately depends on the rates it is allowed to charge? The Hope case is an exceedingly important case in public utility law. I think the most important case after Munn, or maybe even more important than Munn in terms of the daily practice of public utility commissions. It finally gets the courts out of the business of policing the methodology of rate making, and it signals substantial deference to the expertise of regulatory commissions, leaving courts to focus only on whether the end result of the rate-making process is just and reasonable. Now, I do want to mention briefly that it was really not until the 1930s that the federal government gets into the business of utility regulation, with major New Deal era statutes such as the 1934 Federal Communications Act, which I don't know much about, Part 2 of the Federal Power Act in 1935, and the 1938 Natural Gas Act. And in gas and electricity, which I know best, these are classic gap-filling statutes. The federal government has jurisdiction over wholesale sales and transmission or transportation in interstate commerce precisely because the states were not able to regulate in those areas. Congress clearly could have gone much further under its commerce authority to regulate these industries, but it chose not to do so. The intention was to complement, not to displace, state authority. And so we end up with a dual system of regulation. And this is a distinctive structure of federalism. It's not like the cooperative federalism that we see in much of environmental law. It leaves a large sphere of authority with the states, which in my view creates interesting opportunities, but also some challenges for regulation. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Okay. For 25 years or so after World War II, the basic public utility model seems to be working. right? States are doing most of the work. The Federal Power Commission plays a fairly limited role for the most part, with the notable exception of trying to deal with the impossible burden of imposing cost of service regulation on wellhead sales of natural gas as a result of a disastrous 1954 Supreme Court decision, Phillips Petroleum versus Wisconsin, that declared those sales from wellhead producers to be wholesale sales under the Natural Gas Act, and therefore under or subject to the jurisdiction of the Federal Power Commission. But leaving that aside, in general, during this time, the economy is growing, utilities are building more plants and more infrastructure, costs are declining, real prices for electricity are declining throughout this period because of economies of scale. PUCs don't have a lot to do. There are very few rate cases across the country. There are almost none in electricity, 1 or 2 a year across the whole country, because economies of scale in thermal power generation are driving or continuing to deliver declining prices. This all comes crashing down in the 1970s. Under the combined effect of a powerful and sustained critique of the basic model of public utility regulation by economists and lawyers, many of them associated with the University of Chicago, and a constellation of external factors associated with the energy and economic crises of the 1970s. This is Milton Friedman on the left, George Stigler in the middle, and Aaron Director on the right, all from the University of Chicago, who, along with Richard Posner, Hal Dempsitz, and others, launched a withering critique of economic regulation in the 1960s and 1970s. Now I ask you, how is a gentle soul like John Commons or Louis Brandeis ever going to hold his own against guys like this? I also just want to say as an aside, I recognize that there is a stunning lack of diversity in this entire cast of characters that I've put before you today. This story that I'm telling is one that up until recently has really been dominated by white men. That has started to change, but there is still a long way to go here, and I think we need to keep that in mind. Now, going back to the critique that was launched by these economists and others. Basically, if you boil it down to its essentials, the critique consisted of 3 key points. Number one, and Posner was a big proponent of this argument, the category of natural monopoly itself is inherently unstable because of changing economic and technological conditions, and therefore it is not an appropriate basis for regulation. Number 2, regulation is a product of rent-seeking behavior by regulated firms. PUCs are captured. This is George Stigler's argument. This is the public choice theory of regulation, okay? And then number 3, cost of service regulation creates incentives for regulated firms to overinvest in rate base to inflate costs. All of this harms consumers, right? This is partly captured in the so-called Avers-Johnson effect. The general conclusion that emerges from these critiques is straightforward and devastating. Regulation does more harm than good. And these critiques then coincide with a constellation of external factors and structural change in the economy, which seem to arrive with almost perfect timing to vindicate and support these criticisms of regulation that have been taking shape since the 1960s, okay? All of which I think illustrates the general point that in matters of critique, timing is everything. Now, although the effects of the economic crisis varied across sectors, right? The overall stagnation of the economy combined with rising prices, especially for energy, as a result of the 2 oil shocks, put enormous strain on the public utility model. In electricity, economies of scale and thermal power generation had also been exhausted by the late 1960s, and so that, plus higher fuel costs, meant that the era of declining prices was over. And as prices increase and demand stagnates, along with the economy, utilities then find themselves confronting billions of dollars in stranded assets, embodied most dramatically in half-built nuclear power plants that became the subject of significant litigation. And PUCs are caught flat-footed, facing an avalanche of new rate cases. There were 100+ rate cases a year in electricity during the latter part of the 1970s. Hard questions in a lot of these cases about what to do with these stranded assets. And the overall result, in my view, is a hollowing out of the idea of public utility, a diminishment of its experimentalist potential, and a general view that competitive markets would provide the antidote to the pathologies of rate regulation. This all then provides support for the push to restructure the natural gas and electricity sectors following a trend of deregulation that had been applied across various sectors in the 1970s and 1980s. So during the 1980s and 1990s, with some encouragement from Congress, FERC uses its authority under the Natural Gas Act and under the Federal Power Act, flexing its muscles in creative ways, and pushes to unbundle first the natural gas pipeline business and then the electricity business. The basic playbook in both cases was the same. So FERC's key restructuring orders, Order 636 in gas, Order 888 in electricity, seek to unbundle and impose open access common carrier style regulation on the natural gas pipeline business and the electricity transmission business as a basis for creating robust wholesale markets in natural gas and power generation. And in the electricity sector, about half the states are also pushing forward with efforts to introduce retail choice during the late 1990s. There's been a slower, kind of longer term effort to introduce retail choice on the gas side. I'm not going to say anything serious about that. The main goal in all of this, the main goal with restructuring was to use the power of competition to discipline prices. That is, to use the power of competition to set rates and to ensure a just and reasonable price. And so FERC maintains in its restructuring orders that robust competition will do a better job at ensuring just and reasonable rates than regulation. In effect, the just price is the price set by competition, going back to that older Schumpeterian notion of just price and normal competitive markets that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. But this all proved to be easier said than done. And I think we can say with some confidence that while restructuring has brought more competition to parts of these sectors and has been welfare enhancing in various ways, it has also introduced new challenges and has made FERC's job much harder, okay? The challenges of regulating these new markets and ensuring that they deliver just and reasonable prices became painfully apparent during the California energy crisis of 2000 and 2001, which greatly disrupted both gas and electricity markets throughout the Western United States. And among other things, the crisis illustrated how fragile these markets were, how relatively easy they were to manipulate, and how much market design and oversight mattered. And for its part, I think FERC recognized that it had been maybe somewhat naive in its assumption that market forces should be allowed to run their course and that light-handed regulation was sufficient. In 2005, Congress steps in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and provides substantial new enforcement authority to FERC, new provisions for market manipulation, and allows FERC to then start to develop a new set of tools to try to perform the market surveillance and enforcement responsibilities that it has. There's no question that FERC has raised its game significantly since the California crisis, and I'd venture to say that the Commission has come to recognize that efforts to harness the power of competition to deliver just and reasonable prices takes constant vigilance and hard work. Now, if we step back and kind of look at the last 100+ years of utility regulation using the electricity story, right? This chart gives you kind of a sense of some of the major developments. And what we see is a 50+ year period of stability from the early 20th century up until the 1970s, with one basic model dominating across the country: the vertically integrated investor-owned utility that owns generation, transmission, and distribution, providing a bundled retail service subject to cost of service regulation by the Public Utility Commissions, with some modest involvement of the Federal Power Commission in regulating interutility sales and transmission and policing some of the IOUs with respect to their activities vis-a-vis munis and co-ops, okay? Now, the crisis of the 1970s, plus the economic critique that I discussed, lays the groundwork for restructuring in the 1990s. And restructuring was supposed to replace this existing model of the vertically integrated cost of service utility with another single unitary model across the country: competitive wholesale markets regulated by FERC and retail choice at the state level. But it didn't turn out that way. Some states chose not to embrace restructuring, and after the California energy crisis, a number of other states pulled back from restructuring. And the basic structure of federalism in the Federal Power Act that I talked about allowed states to choose whether and how to participate. And so we end up with 3 models of regulation across the country, with roughly 1/3 of the states operating under each model. So in the Northeast and some states in the Midwest, and of course Texas, we have a fully restructured model, competitive wholesale markets, and a retail choice at the state level. In a lot of the Southeast and the West, we have the traditional model, this cost of service model, right, which is quite similar to what we had in that 50-year period after the beginnings of public utility regulation. And then in the middle, we have this hybrid model. California, Minnesota are good examples of the hybrid model, where you have competitive wholesale markets, right, but also still these regulated franchises at the state level. Some of that is changing in California in particular, but this is the basic structure, okay? Now you might say, plenty of people have said, that this kind of complexity can't be good for anyone, except maybe lawyers, right? But I think there's a deeper wisdom to it. And I think that the legislative history of the Federal Power Act and the jurisprudence that has grown up around it strongly support a robust role for the states, and I think expressly contemplate the value of experimentalism. And even though there are many good reasons and ample authority for why you might want to push for a more uniform federal approach, there is also value in diversity. Lots of people for decades have been bemoaning the lack of a coherent national energy policy and calling for a single unified approach to the power sector as the basis for decarbonization or whatever, right? But if there were ever a sector that would benefit from top to bottom federal regulation, one might argue it is electricity. Congress, however, has had multiple opportunities to come back and adjust this. There have been 4 major pieces of omnibus energy legislation since 1978, and every time it has left the basic structure of federalism in place. So my view, and I sort of discussed this in more detail in another article that was not on the list that was sent to you, but if you're interested, let me know. I'd be happy to send it to you. My view is that there are some underappreciated benefits in this diverse, messy system of electricity regulation that we've inherited in the wake of restructuring. In a world of great uncertainty, there is value in diversity. Different states operating under different models can experiment with different approaches to rate design, different incentives for new technologies, different approaches to cost recovery, different business models. And we've seen that across the sector over the last 15 to 20 years. Clearly, we could do a better job at organizing and learning from the experiments that are underway. And there's probably not as much innovation overall as maybe some would like, but there's probably more innovation and experimentation out there than people recognize. And it's not clear that we would get the diversity of experiments across the sector under a single uniform model. To be sure, I would love to see a more strategic and systematic approach to energy policy at the federal level, especially when it comes to climate change. I think we clearly need more robust federal policy, but I also think we should be wary of those who want to expand federal authority at the expense of the state's abilities to continue playing a robust role in electricity regulation. So let me close briefly with a few comments on the continuing relevance of public utility in, I guess, what I would call our current age of disruption. First, my own view, which should be fairly clear by now, is that when it comes to the provision of necessities, the essential services that are provided by public utilities, right, we can't simply leave that to the market. We can certainly continue to work to bring competition into various components of these industries. But when we do that, we need to recognize that it is always a managed or a regulated competition that we're talking about. Competition in this view is a tool. It's not an end state. It's not something that emerges spontaneously. It's something that actually has to be structured and designed almost, right? And so there are a lot of policy choices. There are a lot of political choices about how to structure markets that never go away. And I think we need to put those out on the table and recognize that they never go away. Second, if we think of these systems of provisioning, water, gas, electricity, internet, as part of the basic infrastructure of our economy and our everyday lives, then it should be relatively obvious that the core normative commitments to just price, as well as to universal access, duty to serve, affordability, are more important than ever, especially in the face of the disruptions of COVID and climate change, but also as we enter a new, more expansive phase in the age of electricity with electrification of transportation, buildings, and other sectors of the economy moving forward. Third, I would argue that the public utility model, which has been reinvented multiple times over the last 100 years, is still very much up for grabs. And I don't accept the argument that we should tear it all down, that it should be disruptive, and that we should allow the forces of markets and technology to take over. If we didn't have public utility law, we would have to invent it. Many of the new platforms that occupy so much attention today look a lot like public utilities, and calls for regulation in one form or another are not going away. Finally, I want to emphasize that in a world of great uncertainty, the ability to experiment, to adapt, to iterate, and to learn in the face of new problems is very important. And while the historical record may not exactly be overflowing with examples of Brandeisian experimentalism by PUCs, there are PUCs all around the country engaged in innovative efforts on a variety of fronts. And I think that the experimentalism in public utility law that we're seeing today in the face of climate change and other challenges, and in this moment of great change with respect to technologies and business models, reflects a realization in important respects of that experimentalist impulse that was at the heart of the earlier, more expansive concept of public utility articulated in the early 20th century, but that has lain dormant for so long. We need that creative force today more than ever. And I dare say it is in your hands. So thank you. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, Professor Boyd. In the first lecture, we talked a little bit about how exciting it is to be in the business of electric utility regulation or regulation in general. And you certainly have done a great service to us all and by providing the context and I think reinforcing how exciting it is to be in regulation at this time. I'd like, if you could, to talk about the nexus of just prices and the fact that essentially when we're looking at just prices historically within the context of regulation, we've really looked at incurred costs on the part of the utility. And there's a question about should just prices or how could just prices, what are the issues associated with just prices with respect to the inclusion of externalities? Can a price that does not include, for example, the impact of carbon, how can that be considered a just price?
Yeah, sure. So couple of things there. So there is a long tradition in the history of just price that articulates a cost-based concept of just price that I talk about in the paper that I didn't really get into in any detail in the talk. So I think, you know, the idea of cost of service is providing the basis for setting rates, and that is just and reasonable rates, I think has a long history in the longer history of just price. My own view with respect to the inclusion of environmental externalities or say carbon emissions by internalizing those externalities in rates or prices, there are some kind of legal issues or challenges here with some of the case law. And I know FERC is having a big workshop on this next week. And in looking at that, and I actually write about that in a very recent paper that I wrote, I think that doctrinally, as a doctrinal matter, that rests on a sort of thin reed because some of the case law is really kind of Chevron deference, and you could imagine a defensible approach to doing this. But put that aside, I think the legal questions we should put aside for right now and just think about this conceptually in the context of just price. It strikes me consistent with the notion of just price to include externalities and other possible forms of harm in pricing. But at the end of the day, I think that's really a question of how we define the public interest. And I think it's really, are we willing to kind of rethink and reimagine the concept of public interest and what regulation in the public interest means and what utility regulation in the public interest means to be more expansive and to recognize that carbon emissions in particular and the carbon emissions associated with the power sector are creating enormous challenges for the environment and for the planet. It's interesting that if you go back to the Hope case that I mentioned, Frankfurter, who knew his public utility law better than just about anyone, and who was a big fan of deference to public utility commissions and to the Federal Power Commission, he dissented in the Hope case. He dissents in the Hope case in part because he's worried that the Hope case is going to narrow the range of vision of the commission and not allow the commission to think broadly and expansively about the public interest. And he has a great line about how the public interest is a texture of multiple strands and includes social as well as economic considerations. And I think part of what we've seen kind of post-Hope and post the critique is a narrowing of the public interest in the public utility world, and maybe a narrowing of the idea of what just and reasonable rates means to a purely economic idea. And we need to kind of think more broadly about these other concerns, social and environmental concerns that we have.
Okay. We have another question, which is, please give some examples, real or potential, of economic coercion in the utility industry, past or present. How might we be watchful for these occurring in the current age of disruption?
Well, I tend to think historically when I think about coercion. And so, for example, next week in my energy law class, I'll be teaching the Otter Tail Power case and the Federal Power Commission versus Conway case. Both of those cases involved efforts to essentially squeeze munis and co-ops kind of out of the utility business. And I do think in this world of disruption where we're seeing a lot of kind of new thinking around business models and approaches to regulation, new enthusiasm in places like Boulder, Colorado, where I live part of the time, and elsewhere for municipal utilities, there is, I think, a need to be vigilant about the way the incumbent IOUs may be acting vis-a-vis those nascent efforts. I don't think it's useful to vilify the investor-owned utilities as always being opposed to that form of competition or those additional forms of public utility. But I do see that as an issue to keep an eye on. I think it'll be interesting to watch in the kind of broader approach to electrification, how the utilities and the public utility commissions are approaching the building out of charging infrastructure, for example, and other infrastructural investments for the electrification of buildings and things like that, and the extent to which you want to create some competition around some of that, the services that could be provided there, and the role of the utility. That's kind of what I'm thinking sort of right now, but I'd be happy to give it some more thought and respond to folks if there are other questions there.
Yes, there are other questions. There's a question about your UCLA Law Review article. The question is, you identified in the article Milton Friedman and George Stigler, but you didn't mention Alfred Kahn and public choice work of James Buchanan, although you did cite Kahn in both journal article footnotes. Is the less prominence you've given to Kahn and Buchanan because you merely see them as extensions of Friedman and Stigler? Or do they have a different approach that you just didn't mention?
Yeah, I guess I've always seen Kahn as different and more sympathetic to regulation for a whole bunch of reasons, given his experience and sort of the world that he grew up in terms of his training. So I see him as distinct from the Chicago school. Buchanan, for sure, I think is very much of the same cloth with respect to the development of public choice as Stigler, and I think takes off on a lot of that. I guess I probably don't know enough about Buchanan to say for sure that he made major novel contributions, but my sense is that when we think about economic regulation, it's largely kind of derivative of Stigler and others, but I'd want to go back and check on that. Kahn, to me, is a much more interesting figure, and it seems to me is more open to the idea, right, that, as he often said, there are exercises in political economy here, and we are trying to think about, the right balance between imperfect regulation and imperfect markets or imperfect competition. And so there was a realism or a pragmatism there, I think, that didn't lend itself to the sort of hard-hitting critique that we see with the Chicago School, which of course served its purposes, but also at the end of the day, I think you could come back and say a lot of the critiques that they made, as I point out in that UCLA article, are critiques that we had seen before. Commons and Brandeis and others were aware of the challenges, right? And the question is kind of how far you want to take them and how serious you think they are. I do think that there is an argument to be made here that at times the Chicago School had sort of stacked the decks, because when you compare, right, ideal markets versus, real world regulation is going to lose every time. And that's been said a million times by a lot of people, but I think there's some truth to that. I don't think Alfred Kahn ever did that, really. I think at the end of the day, he recognized that this was hard, and he recognized that there were problems with the public utility model and that we could make improvements, but that we needed to experiment. And if we learned along the way that things were harder than we thought, we maybe needed to try again.
And I joined the staff of the New York Public Service Commission, the Department of Public Service, shortly after Alfred Kahn left as chairman. And I will say that apropos of your discussion in terms of having adequate staff and professional staff, that he was very keen on having a truly professional staff at the commission. And it was a real pleasure joining the commission and living in his shadows, if you will, there. The next question goes to determining a just price or evaluating a just price in a competitive market like telecom. So how does one need to determine a just price in a competitive market, or we might want to say restructured market in that way, because those markets may or may not be competitive?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to speak to this based on my experience in electricity and natural gas, because I don't know telecom as well as I should. I know it's really complicated, and I need to spend more time learning some telecom. But I think, the goal here—
We will have a course on telecom shortly, so we're happy to have you join us.
I'll be back. Yeah. I think the goal here, as I said, is that if you have a structurally competitive market, then we can rely upon the forces of competition to ensure that prices are the just and reasonable, right? That the competitive price is the just price, that the competitive price is close to the price that you that is close to a cost base or marginal cost base price, right? It's more complicated than that, though, when you look at electricity, and I would argue gas. So let me sort of back up and go through this. And this is an argument that I take on in a recent paper. So I think initially, right, FERC thought when it was building these competitive markets, when it was restructuring, that it should focus first and foremost on the structure of the markets. And that's why it develops the ideas of blanket marketing certificates and market-based rate authority, which are essentially permission slips to go out and sell in these markets, and are tied to these market screens that are tied to essentially antitrust ideas of concentration indexes, right? It became very clear in the California electricity crisis and the broader energy crisis that that wasn't enough. And FERC recognized that these markets could actually, the prices could be manipulated, right? And so it needed a whole new additional set of provisions and enforcement authority to deal with the behavior of market participants, even market participants that didn't necessarily have market power. And I think that's where you get then an explosion of FERC's activities in trying to police these markets for manipulation, the incorporation of securities law, fraud and manipulation provisions into the Natural Gas Act and the Federal Power Act. I would argue that even that, though, is not quite enough, because in both natural gas and electricity, again, I don't know telecom, you also have specific ways of price making that are at the heart of these industries. And so the natural gas price indexes in natural gas markets and the electricity auctions in electricity markets, those technologies of price making also themselves matter quite a bit. And I think we need to be thinking about the rules and the design choices that are made in constructing those ways of price making, and think about those from a regulatory standpoint as well. And I think doing that helps us to understand a bit more what's happening, say, in the capacity markets now in electricity, where you're seeing a lot of fights and a lot of rent-seeking behavior across all different market actors to try to structure the price making in a way that will advantage one set of resources vis-a-vis another. My view is that there's no pre-political set of criteria for making those choices. That's what I was trying to say at the end. You can't get around having to make choices, and those choices are necessarily going to be political choices at some level, right? And that needs to be kind of upfront and on the table. This idea that there's this mythical way of designing markets so that we can always have a quote free market is problematic. And so that means that, to go back to the question, just price in some ways is again contingent on what we think the public interest is and how we design the markets and how we try to channel competition in a way to promote that public interest. So it's not something that we can discover in the world, it's something that we have to make collectively in how we decide to design these markets. And that's turning out to be a hard thing to do with a lot of contestation and conflict.
The next question is whether or not you see any public utility characteristics in social media platforms such as Facebook.
So I'm not on any social media, and I fight with my kids about this on a regular basis. So I can't say for sure, having never been on social media. I do think that some of the platforms, as I understand them, and the ways of price making that we're seeing emerging, often algorithmic forms of price making that we're seeing emerging in some of these online marketplaces, raise questions about the integrity of those markets that I think should suggest, a closer regulatory look. And of course, a lot of people are thinking about this in kind of the new antitrust and the revival of Brandeis and thinking about new ways of thinking about antitrust. But I think we should be thinking about this in the context of infrastructure and utility regulation. If these are in fact vital infrastructures for everyday life, if they are vital infrastructures for getting on and participating in the economy, then we need, I think you need as public utility regulators to be thinking about them as part of that broad set of industries that are providing necessities to allow people to get on with their lives and to allow the economy to function. And it strikes me that Facebook, right, is obviously quite important for a whole lot of people. I worry about it for a whole bunch of reasons. I don't know enough, though, to say that there are distinct kind of public utility characteristics there. It certainly seems like there are network effects in a big way that are driving it, right, to look like a monopoly.
So you might say that it's affected with a public interest.
For sure, I would say it's affected with the public interest if we were back to that line of cases. But of course, after Nebbia, we don't have to worry about that. So the question is do we actually enact laws, right, or statutes that declare it to be, a particular type of industry subject to regulation?
So the next question goes more into the three models that you presented with respect to the different types of regulatory structures. And the question is, how is cost of federal regulation, environmental, et cetera, of power plants impacting cost models in the three regulatory frameworks that you provided?
So how are the costs?
I think we're talking about costs, how does it affect the business model of those different power plants being in either of those three?
Yeah, well, it's really in terms of the business model for the power plants, it really goes down to the two models, right? You're either a merchant generator in a competitive, organized wholesale market, or you're generation that is part of a traditional utility, perhaps. You might be a merchant generator selling in some of those cost of service states as well. But if you think of merchant generators on the one side and sort of utility-owned generation on the other, it seems to me that under our general understanding of cost of service regulation, the cost of environmental regulations, right, can be passed on, not entirely, but it depends, right, but to a large extent can be passed on to the ratepayers. And there are things you can do with that model. I think you can move the food bowl around, if you will, and make utilities do things and think about the utility as a tool, as a public servant, as Brandeis called the actual public utilities, the businesses, right? With merchant generators, of course, the whole idea with restructuring was to shift a lot of the risk of investment and cost back onto the merchant generators to take it away from the ratepayers. And so there, I think there's much greater risk, if the regulatory world changes suddenly and you've got plants that were in the money are suddenly out of the money because of new environmental regulations, right? Under that model, the merchant generators are going to be on the hook. And this is part of what we're seeing, I think, in the capacity markets is the merchant generators are saying we cannot continue to operate given what's happening with the pricing structures in these markets. So we need state subsidies and supports to be able to, quote, level the playing field. In cost of service, I think, if everything is working, and again, I recognize that could be a big if, but if everything is working, it should be relatively easy to manage costs over time. And then, of course, if the world changes dramatically and you end up with stranded assets, we have a long history of dealing with stranded assets. And that's always a question of balance between ratepayers and investors.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on 4 o'clock, and but Professor Boyd has kindly offered to stay longer if we had more questions. We have a number more questions, so why don't we go through a few more of those and before
Sure.
we finish up. So, in your summary of the intellectual history of just prices, you spent a lot more time on ancient and medieval thought than the marginal revolution of 1870. Does the concept of marginal utility that Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras developed offer less insight for your work at PUCs than Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas?
These are tough questions. I'd love to know who's asking these questions and follow up. No,
I can let you know. I'll email you who that is.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I interpret the kind of marginal revolution and the rise of neoclassical economics as bringing a kind of formalism into economic thinking that in the end prevails over and pushes to the side the institutional economics of John Commons and the legal realism of people like Robert Lee Hale and progressive like Brandeis and others. And so if you start with the marginal revolution and trace that forward to the rise of kind of formal neoclassical economics in the 20th century and the move to formal modeling and the mathematicization of economics, I think it sort of pushes to the side these ethical concerns. There's really no place for this. And to me, the best critique of that comes from an English economist and a great interlocutor of Keynes, Joan Robinson. And I think I quote Joan Robinson a bit. I think she is in the Just Price paper and in this other paper I'm working on. And so I think there's great pluralism in economics in the early 20th century. And I think one of the things we lost by kind of by the mid-century is that pluralism, and economics becomes a much more formal mathematical discipline focused on modeling. And there's really no place for these broader social and ethical concerns, which I still believe are very much at the heart of the concept of public utility, and that's part of the kind of recovery work I've been trying to do from the beginning. I think we make a mistake if we see public utility regulation as just a pure exercise in economics and the application of economics. I think there are a lot of people who want it to be that, perhaps, and I think that feeds into the critique from the Chicago School and others as well, that it's bad economics. But if you put it in that broader, more expansive context, then yes, it's possible that I guess I'm not suggesting that, utility commissioners and their staff should go back and read Aristotle and Aquinas. What I'm trying to suggest is that there are residual or recessive strains in terms of these broader, expansive notions, these normative commitments in public utility that are worth kind of thinking about in terms of your daily work.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of using technical formula approach to calculate fair returns with cost-based rate making? For example, determining the rate of return on equity based upon capital asset pricing model.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting really to the kind of limits of my knowledge of kind of the day-to-day practices of utility regulation. My sense is that, when we think of how we compute the revenue requirement and how we then think about rate base, we've made a lot of progress. But of course, the return on equity part of the rate of return is a challenge and has always been a challenge. I guess I would punt a little bit and go back to Justice Rehnquist's opinion in the Duquesne case, which was a case that involved stranded assets, half-built nuclear power plants, that Duquesne and other utilities were trying to deal with in the 1980s. And what he says there is, yes, all we care about is the end result. There's no one right formula. Hope teaches us that it doesn't really matter how you get there. The methodology is really up to the commission. But we should recognize too that you got to look at all of it together. And if all of it together adds up to an end result that is just and reasonable, no problem. But right, you can get to the same place by turning the dials in different ways, by dialing up return on equity perhaps, or dialing down rate base or whatever. You can get to the same place, and there's no one right way, and there may be infirmities in the different approaches that we take, right? But in the end, it's really all that we care about, as Hope says, is the end result. However, he does say at the very end of that opinion that if you had a utility commission that is sort of going back and forth arbitrarily between different approaches to something like return on equity, where investors can't really plan and they're being exposed to risk, I think, then you might have a constitutional issue. You could have rates that might turn out to be confiscatory, and that the investors were never really sufficiently on notice for that. I've never seen a case that really deals with that in the context of return on equity, but you could imagine some fact patterns where that could be an issue. I don't, have enough, I think, information to be able to talk about the pros and cons of capital asset pricing models versus other approaches to return on equity. So I'll have to plead ignorance on that.
And we will,
I'd love to learn more about it though.
And we will have courses on different methods of estimating the cost of capital. We've been discussing developing those courses with folks from the regulatory community. And by the way, to you out there, if you want to participate with us in developing courses, we're happy to have you. Just contact us at the RTI at NRRI.org. And we look forward to engaging the regulatory community. This is in a sense, a group effort in terms of trying to train the regulatory community. I think one last question, which is, should utilities adjust energy rates for environmental justice communities who are disproportionately impacted by the energy services they pay? For example, air pollution, climate change, et cetera.
I guess I would say my own view is that, yes, we should certainly be exploring that. And I think it's a defensible approach to rate setting that draws on a history of, lifeline rates and ideas of trying to recognize that, one, these are vital, important services, essential services, necessities, as I said, and that, not everyone has the ability to pay full freight. And so that's where you get the development of lifeline rates for poor customers who are not able to pay. It strikes me that you could pivot relatively easily or incorporate within that kind of broader set of objectives an approach that tries to deal with some of the harms that have been posed on certain communities. How you operationalize that and actually make that work in practice could be a challenge, but it'd be an interesting docket to open up, and it'd be an interesting set of issues to explore.
Terrific. Well, this has been a really enlightening hour plus, and I really appreciate the fact that you have joined us today. If other folks have questions to follow up, please send them to us. Comments and suggestions are welcome at rti@nrri.org. We look forward to you all joining us next week when Chairman Willie Phillips will talk about the products of regulation. What is it that we, as regulators, what is our product? What is the outcome of our activities? It should be a really engaging talk. And again, I can't thank you enough for your time today, for your time, Professor, and for all of your time who've joined us in the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity.